Most of my knowledge of superheroes comes from movies or TV shows. For instance, my introduction to X-Men and Spider-Man came from the cartoons in the 90s. I love the Iron Man movies, but I've never read any of the Iron Man comics. And likewise, even though the Teen Titans have been around since the 1960s, and this particular team first appeared in the 80s, I had no idea they existed until I saw the cartoon in 2003. Now, technically speaking, it's not the best superhero cartoon ever, but still there's something special about it. Something about these characters made me want to read the comics, and so, in a very rare instance at the time, I actually found myself already familiar with the source material by the time certain events would happen on the show. The End is a 3-part adaptation of The Terror of Trigon. It is easily one of the most ambitious arcs from the show. Unfortunately, knowing about the comics also helps highlight a few of the cartoon's shortcomings. Admittedly, part of this is because the cartoon was aimed at a younger audience, and the characters themselves were younger too, so there were certain things they just weren't allowed to show. But there were also a few choices that just felt like missed opportunities. I'm not going to pick on every little detail since parts of the story obviously had to be changed in order to fit the new continuity, but there are a few moments where comparisons to the comics are going to come up, and unfortunately this is also going to make the review sound a lot more negative than I would probably like it to. Just keep in mind that I do love this show, and I meant what I said about these episodes being good, but I'm also sharing my own experience here, and in my experience, well, you take a look at the difference between the cartoon and the source material and then decide which one stands out more. Also, there will be spoilers here for the comic as well as for the show. Now, on the show, it was previously established that the series bad guy Slade, also known in the comics as Deathstroke the Terminator, had died and was later resurrected as one of Trigon's minions, appearing to Raven to remind her of her destiny. You see, Raven is one of the more fascinating characters in that her father Trigon is a transdimensional demon, and she was born in order to allow him to travel to Earth in his true form and bring about the end of the world. Despite that, she dedicated her entire life to helping people. But now that day has come, and at first she tries to be extra nice to her friends, giving them the best day that she can. Eventually they figure out what's going on, and it turns out that they've been preparing a safe room so that Trigon can't get to her. Slade even shows up to challenge them, and despite their best efforts, Raven ends up going with them in order to spare their lives. Okay, here's my first major issue with the show. In the comic, Raven gets corrupted by Trigon's influence and ends up turning evil. In the show, she simply gives up hope and goes along with the bad guys because the prophecy can't be stopped, and she simply wants her friends to suffer as little as possible. Now, there could be potential with that, but then we learn that she has to go to a specific place miles away and recite a specific spell in order to open the portal for Trigon. All the while, her friends are behind her saying, "Hey, all you have to do is not do that." Seriously, you know how this is gonna happen. You have to go to the place and say the thing. So just don't go to the place. And even if you do, even if you get dragged there kicking and screaming, then just don't say the thing. How is this difficult? Explain why this is so inevitable. Because the more I think about it, it seems like you literally have to do nothing and everything will be fine. At least the comic had the decency to say that Raven wasn't in control of her own actions. The show goes out of its way to point out that what's happening makes no goddamn sense. So I'm sorry, but point goes to the comic on this one. And that's part 1. Parts 2 and 3 get more into the Terror of Trigon territory, and the cartoon actually does a very good job at copying the visuals from the comic, minus a few of the more horrifying details. Here Slade shows up after being double-crossed by Trigon and says that Raven is still alive, so he and Robin team up and fight through hell together. It turns out Slade was trying to get his body back, so now he's alive again, and Robin finds Raven, who's now a little kid Raven, and supposedly she doesn't have her powers anymore, though we find out later that's basically bullshit. Meanwhile, the other Titans try to keep Trigon distracted, and we get another bit from the comics where they have to fight evil versions of themselves, which Trigon says are supposed to represent their inner demons. Now, in the comics, this ends up being much more literal. In fact, they aren't even awake during it. They each have to fight their evil selves inside a dreamscape, and it's much more psychological. And they all win. They find a way to defeat themselves, and it turns out to be a trap because Trigon was actually trying to bring out the worst in them by making them kill themselves. Whereas in the show, it's just a straightforward fist fight. And on the show's terms, it's done very well, but it feels a lot less personal, though I will give credit to the evil cyborg for mentioning his dead mom. And ultimately, they cheat their way out of it by going, "We're just too tough. We can't beat ourselves. But you know what? We can beat each other. Let's switch opponents." I mean, Even at the time, that kind of thing was already cliche, so not only does it miss the point of the original story, it kinda takes out the stuff that was interesting before. But then we finally get to the ending, and yes, I have to compare it yet again. In the original story, Raven actually sacrifices herself to stop Trigon. We find out that she had been training to separate her soul from her body, so when she turns evil, Raven herself isn't even there anymore. After the other Titans defeat themselves and now come back supposedly evil, they actually kill Raven's body. She then gets supercharged with the power of Azar to defeat Trigon. And that's it. Raven was dead after that. Of course, her spirit was still around, so by comic book rules, she eventually came back later. In the show, she still has her powers after all, which apparently she got from her friends. So she makes a nature versus nurture speech about how Trigon didn't raise her friends raised her. So now she has the magic of friendship and uses the elements of harmony to banish him like Nightmare Moon. And this actually aired about half a decade before My Little Pony. Though for this one, honestly, I can see it going either way. I personally prefer the ending from the comics because it had more weight to it and they actually explain how Trigon was defeated, so it makes more sense. However, while the comic ending had more impact on the team itself, the show tried to make a bigger point about choosing your own destiny. How even when facing the end of the world, you can still choose to do something good. And that has a pretty big impact as well. The end came literally at the end of season 4, and like I said, these are some of the best episodes that the show had to offer, until season 5 tried to outdo everything, and it's easily the darkest that the show ever got. I can't really say if I'd like it better if I hadn't read the comics because I did, and goddamn if it didn't leave a tremendous impact on me. Even now, rewatching the show years later, I still can't separate it from what I already know about the original work. Ultimately though, Raven was my favorite character from the show, specifically because of episodes like this, and Spellbound and Prophecy, but anyway, it definitely has its issues, but as long as you can get past how forced the story feels during the first act, I still recommend this one.